Hi, everybody out there. Thank you for joining us for the Acing the MCAT webinar. It's right around 9 o'clock. We're going to give a few more minutes for some stragglers to join us. I wanted to, first of all, say welcome. Thanks for taking some time out of your night to spend it with us. I think you're going to get some awesome tips tonight on the MCAT, and judging by where you guys are, we're going to have tips for all of you guys, whether you're doing this in the next month or the next 2 to 6 months, or even beyond that. So I'm glad a lot of people are thinking about this super early. We're going to have a lot of great insights for those, as well as for those who are taking it soon. So give us a couple more minutes. Tell your friends if they haven't logged on, or if they need to log on, to remind them to log on. And then we're going to get started again in a few minutes here. So hang tight, and we will be getting rolling in a few. I also want to let you guys know that one of the best things about the webinar is going to be the question and answer session, where you're going to get to really pick the brain of experts on admissions as well as MCAT. So I want you guys to utilize the question and answer function in GoToMeeting. You'll find that on your screen, and you can ask questions along the way, and we're going to try to answer as many of them as we can all the way at the end. So these can be questions about literally anything, about going to med school, the pre-med life, obviously about the MCAT. Whatever questions you have, feel free to drop them in there. What study resources to use, what your schedule should be, any kinds of questions on the MCAT, we're going to answer, really on pre-meds in general, we're going to answer at the end of the session. So I encourage you guys to use the question and answer question and answer function throughout the session, so that you guys can get the best information possible. So again, give us about 1 or 2 more minutes. We're going to let a few last people join in here, and then we're going to get rolling. All right, everybody, it's about 9:02, so we're gonna head right into it. Again, thank you everybody out there for joining us. I'm so excited that you guys are taking some time out of your busy schedules. I know there's a lot going on for all of you guys to learn a little bit about the MCAT and how to perform well on the test. I think you guys are going to really get a lot of awesome information out of our webinar today, and I hope you guys come out of here thinking, wow, you know what, I learned something in order for me to take this back to my actual MCAT study and to do well. So I just want to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Mehta. I'm Med School Coach's founder and lead advisor, and I have with me today 2 just amazing MCAT experts. I mean, these guys are literally the cream of the crop when it comes to MCAT. I have Ken Tao with us, who's the director of MCAT programming at Med School Coach, former Princeton Review master tutor. He is really known as one of the foremost experts in the entire country when it comes to MCAT in developing content, as well as study schedules, and helping students really master the topics. And then we also have Alex with us. He was the founder of CurveSetter. CurveSetter is a great video series we're going to be talking about a little bit as we move on here. For those of you guys looking for some MCAT help, it's a really good starting point. So before I ask these guys to introduce themselves and just say a quick hi, I wanted to take a couple of minutes to let you guys know how we're going to run the webinar tonight. So both Ken and Alex are going to give us a ton of tips on how to score high at the MCAT, how to make a study plan, what their tips and strategies are that really work. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on the MCAT and how an admissions office may use it, how a medical school may use it in evaluating your application, and what you should be looking at as a potential pre-med. Now, a couple of things, as I mentioned before, we're going to be using a question and answer function on GoToWebinar. So please feel free to ask questions as you go. Drop questions. We're going to get to as many of them as we can at the end of the session when we really sit down and pick everybody's brain. And they can be questions on pre-med life. They can be questions on MCAT. They can be questions on admissions. Whatever you want to ask, please feel free to ask away. So I wanted to take this opportunity to welcome in Ken and Alex. Ken, you want to just say hi?
Yeah, hey everyone, this is Ken. Happy to be here and looking forward to answering your guys' questions.
Awesome. Alex, you want to shoot
You
a quick
got,
eye?
yeah, thank you. It's an honor to be here today. I'm really excited to answer your questions and to provide you with any insight that I had, over the last few years in MCAT tutoring.
Awesome. So while we get started, I'm going to talk just very generally about a few ideas around the MCAT and what it means to you guys. So I had thrown up this poll question on sort of when you'll be taking the MCAT, and as I said, a lot of you guys are all over the spectrum. That's great. We're going to have advice for all of you guys. And I have a couple of additional questions for you here that I'd like to ask you guys, which is, how do you plan on studying for the MCAT? Are you going to self-study? Are you going to take one of these commercial courses, maybe a self-paced online course, or are you thinking about getting a private tutor as you think about studying for the MCAT? I'm curious to know what everybody out there is thinking about doing or potentially currently doing. Awesome. So let's share the results. So a lot of people out there self-studying. A lot of people also looking towards the big commercial courses, the Kaplan, the Princeton reviews. Some people kind of looking towards maybe some of the newer self-paced online courses, and then a couple of people are looking at private tutors to do well, or maybe a combination of all three of these or four of these things can really benefit you. So we're going to talk a little bit about which of these options may work best for you. Obviously, all of them work for different people, and there's nothing wrong with any of them. But for a certain subset of people, some of these options may work better than others. So let me just give you a quick introduction of what we're going to cover. So we're going to cover how to create an effective MCAT study plan. A lot of tips and tricks for the CARS section. Now, for those of you guys who are currently in the midst of studying for the MCAT or are going to be taking it once, you know that the CARS section typically is sometimes the hardest section for people to really grasp, particularly how to study for it. Some people can do really well in it, but a lot of people just struggle and just general study for it because there's not a textbook, there's not a biology 101 course that you can go through for CARS. So we're going to give you a lot of tips for that. We're also going to look at some of the higher end scores. So how do you push your score by 10 or more points, and what target score should you be aiming for in order to be successfully accepted into med school? And then, as I mentioned, at the end, we're going to go through the roundtable Q&A. We already have a bunch of questions on the Q&A, so keep them coming. Just type them as we go, and we will get to them all the way at the end. So just quickly, I'm going to go over a quick brief overview of the test format. Now, I know a lot of you guys know that, and I know a lot of you guys probably already have some of this background, but for those of you that don't, the MCAT changed in 2015 to the new 2015 MCAT, which basically kept a spectrum of scores from 0 to 45, essentially, but kind of shifted that from 472 to 528. So inclusive, those numbers are actually exactly the same as 0 to 45. But they sort of just shifted the way that the score is reported. And they added a new section called Psychology, Social, and Biological Foundations of Behavior. And they changed the MCAT a little bit to reflect a little bit more of the clinical nature of what medical schools are aiming for, a little bit more about what a medical student may eventually have to do and how they may have to go about it. Now, what's critical to you is that the MCAT changed, and I would say a lot of the different testing companies out there maybe didn't change with it. So a lot of them are using old videos, old questions, old formats to kind of test you. And I think that's something that you guys want to keep in mind as you choose a course, as you think about how to study. Is this really designed for the new MCAT, or are they recycling a lot of the material from old ones? Now, you guys probably know that there's passage-based questions and freestanding questions on the MCAT, and there is no penalty for guessing. Every single question is worth the same amount of points. And basically, at the end, you are scored on the curve, and 500 being sort of your average mean score. So, I've been doing admissions advising now for 10 years. I've helped thousands of students through the application process. And there's a lot that goes into a med school application, right? It's your personal statement, your extracurriculars, your letters of recommendation, all the research you've done, all the volunteer work you've done, all the clinical experience you have, all that stuff makes a great application and what med schools are truly looking for. But none of those things are filterable, is what I call it. So these things are not filterable in the sense of when a med school has 15,000 applications, maybe even up to 18 to 20,000 applications that a med school might be getting, there's no way for them to read all those personal statements at the end of the day. There's no way for them to read 5 letters of recommendation each for all those applicants. So they have to have some way to screen out applicants. So they have to have some way to at least prioritize the applicants that they're going to be looking at. And honestly, that's where the MCAT comes in. The MCAT is a great equalizer, right? Everybody in the country is taking the same exact test. We don't care what you did in undergrad in terms of your different coursework. If you went to a community college versus you went to Harvard, you are taking the same MCAT, and your score on that really levels the playing field. So everybody knows the MCAT's important. It's not rocket science for me to tell you guys that the MCAT is important. But what I will tell you is, it's not something to be taken lightly whatsoever, no matter how good your GPA is, no matter how good your extracurriculars are. Because I hear all the time, well, I really have great extracurriculars, so I think my MCAT it doesn't have to be high. Or I really have a great letter of recommendation, so I can get away with this lower MCAT score. The reality is you probably can't. It really, truly is the most important test that you'll take in order to get into med school. And so in a lot of cases, probably the most important test you'll take in your entire life, because if you don't get into med school, obviously you're doing something completely different. So I really encourage you guys to take this seriously, and maybe even more seriously than you've already been taking it or thinking about it. And so, a quick poll question I'll throw up here is, which section on the MCAT worries you the most? Now, I know a lot of you guys are worried about a lot of different sections, but I want to kind of get an idea of which section do you guys truly fear as you go through the MCAT. We talked a little bit about the fact that for a lot of people, verbal and cars is definitely one of the harder sections, or one of the sections that they have most trouble with. But actually, you guys out there seem to say that physics chem is actually this section that you guys are most afraid of. Very small percentage for the psych soc, small percentage for biology, and then a big percentage for verbal cars again. Now, this is kind of reflective typically of where the distribution of people's majors are. A lot of people are biology majors, so they feel very comfortable in biology, but maybe not so much in the physics chem and the cars section. Now, a question I get all the time, right? What is a good MCAT score? And the answer in big bold letters are, it depends, because it depends on a lot of different factors, obviously, but I think we can give you a little bit more specific an answer. And I think this grid kind of really helps you understand where your MCAT score needs to be based on your GPA. So again, not rocket science for me to tell you. The higher your GPA is, the lower your MCAT score can be to sort of have a chance of acceptance. But the bottom line is that for a US MD school, you are really looking towards a 506, 510, 514, somewhere in this range to truly get yourself above a coin flip chance. So let's say you're sort of a good student in college, you have a 3.7 GPA, not spectacular, you don't have a 4.0, 3.7 or so, you've gotten A's and A minuses in most of your classes. If you come out with a 500, you actually have less than a 50% chance of getting into school. Even if you come out with a 509, you have about a 50% chance. So that's why typically if a student is going to just point blank ask me, what score do I need to aim for the MCAT on the MCAT? I typically tell them, listen, I think we need to aim for at least a 510. But obviously there's a lot of different considerations and variability within that. Take a look at this chart, really study it for those of you guys who are out there who are taking the MCAT. Obviously having an aim is important for you. So thinking about where you're going to get to, I think, is a reasonable starting point to say, okay, I need to get to, because I have a 3.4 GPA, in order to have more than a 50% chance, I got to get to that 514 range or so. So I got to work doubly as hard. I think it's important to kind of keep this chart in mind. And it also gives you perspective that, hey, listen, for those of you that unfortunately aren't scoring as high, it's going to be really tough to get into medical school in the US. And so we really need to push this as far as possible. Again, not rocket science, but just kind of re-emphasizing some of the things you guys already know. So with that, I'm actually going to we're going to turn it over and get a little bit into sort of content, study planning, cars, and I'm going to turn it over to Ken, who's going to talk a little bit about this. Now, as I mentioned, Ken is our Director of MCAT programming at Med School Coach. He is a absolutely phenomenal master tutor. His students have basically kicked butt on the test from left and right. He really gets people to raise their score super high. So he's going to help us and help you guys go through a few different ideas here on how to create an effective MCAT study plan and attacking the CAR section and how to make that big jump in the score. So Ken, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Sahil. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is how to create an effective MCAT study plan. So The first part of this process is you need to make sure that you find an adequate time within your schedule that you're able to focus specifically on the MCAT. And this is very important because the MCAT covers many semesters worth of college courses. And chances are by the time you take the MCAT, it will have been a while since you reviewed a lot of that content. So you've forgotten a lot and you need enough time to review all of that content. Another important thing to keep in mind is that the courses that you take in college, the curriculum, the syllabi in those courses do not perfectly align with the content you will see in the MCAT. So that means there's a lot of content you learned in your courses that you don't need to know for the MCAT, and vice versa, content that you didn't go over in your courses that you need to know for the MCAT. So for both of those reasons, you really do need a dedicated period of time that you can focus on the MCAT. Now, as I've already clearly pointed out, content review is very important for the exam. Among all of the standardized exams out there, the MCAT is arguably the one that is the most content-based. And that means that there's a lot of questions that you cannot answer unless you just know the content. Now, of course, as all of you probably know, that content alone is also not enough. If all you have in your brain is all of these facts memorized, that still won't let you get a high score on the MCAT. And that's because unlike the other pre-health exams, the DAT, OAT, PCAT, and so forth, where the science questions on the exam are all freestanding questions, meaning that you really just need to have a bunch of facts memorized, the MCAT is different in that the vast majority of the questions are passage-based, which means they're going to introduce a passage with content and situations that you've never heard about before. You're going to be asked to read the text and evaluate the text and apply your knowledge of science to all of that new information to figure out the answer to those questions. Doing so requires you to develop effective strategies and techniques, and you can really only do that by doing practice questions, practice passages, and practice tests. And as you're going to hear us echo multiple times today, the best AAMC practice questions out there, the best MCAT practice questions out there are those written by the creators of the MCAT, the AAMC practice questions. So all of you absolutely should make sure you do all of the practice questions released by the AAMC. And just to give you a quick idea, for those of you that are going to be starting your studies soon, it takes about 120 hours just to complete all of the AAMC practice questions, meaning even if you're studying full time, that would take you at least 3 weeks just to do questions, and that would be a pretty stressful situation. So definitely recommend more time than that. Now, the last part of a very important study plan is a lot of students know this. They'll be like, great, I'm going to go ahead and review my content, then I'm going to go ahead and do practice questions. But a lot of students doing this still may not reach their target scores, and that's because they did not include this last aspect of an effective MCAT study plan, which is to do an intensive review of all of the questions that they're getting wrong. Now, the reason why this is important is because if you want to be able to see improvement in your studies, you need to identify the reason why you're getting questions incorrect. And once you figure out why you're getting questions wrong, you need to change whatever it is so that you get those questions right in the future. So some of those reasons why you might be getting questions wrong could be that you're lacking some content. And great, that's easy to fix. You just have to go study some more. But other questions might be because you read the passage, you forgot the passage, and then you try to treat every single question as a freestanding question. So in that case, you need to tell yourself when you get to the questions, if I cannot answer the question using my knowledge of science, I must rely on the passage to answer these questions. So put all of those together and you'll have an effective study plan. The next thing I want to talk about, as you can see here on the slide, are some tips and tricks for the MCAT card section. Now, the main thing you should know for the card section is that the section does not require any prerequisite knowledge of science. So that means the writers of the exam, they're not expecting you to know anything about whatever literature or social studies topic that they're writing about. So instead of the content within the text, it's really what the text is, how the text is written that you need to focus on. And The first tip to be able to do better on MCAT cards question is to read with enthusiasm. And this is important because I know a lot of you out there are science majors and you're used to reading science textbooks, which is, all these scientific facts that you find fascinating. And when you get to these cards passages on, these topics like philosophy and politics, you might find them really boring and not be interested in reading them. But if you come in with this mindset that you don't want to read these passages, then it becomes very difficult for you to engage yourself with the text, which is really what you need to be able to do to really understand how the text is written and be able to answer those questions. The next thing that's very important is the strategies. So at some point or another, you're going to develop some sort of strategy for approaching the passage and approaching the questions. Whatever strategy you choose to use, make sure you evaluate them. Make sure that they actually work. So what I mean by this is whenever you do a practice passage, at the end, you're going to go ahead and look at the solutions. Before you actually read the solutions, just take note of which questions you got wrong. For instance, you might say, hey, on question number 2, I chose B, but the answer was actually A. So again, before you read the solutions, go back to the question in the passage text. And now that you're not under any time pressure and you have unlimited time, apply your strategies and techniques again. Because if under those situations, your strategies and techniques can still not lead you to the right answer, then there's clearly a problem. For instance, your strategy or approach may be flawed, or perhaps you might not have fully mastered them. And the last thing I want to talk about for a great tip for the card section is to read MCAT cards like text regularly. Again, I referred to this earlier, but with the MCAT card section, it's not the content within the text, it's really how the text is written. So again, if you're not used to reading MCAT cards like text regularly, these aren't things that you're thinking about at all. So it's very good practice for you to try to read MCAT cards like text regularly. And as you do so, you want to be focusing on things like, what is the thesis of this text? What are the main points of each paragraph? What is the author's tone or attitude towards the arguments and counter arguments that he or she is presenting? Are there any rhetorical shifts? All of these questions that you normally aren't thinking about, you will want to think about. And a great way to do that is to read MCAT cards like text. And if you send us an email, we'll be happy to share with you a few links with a few of these great websites with these texts. So the last thing I want to talk about is how to improve your MCAT score substantially by 10 or more points. And I get these calls all the time from students. Essentially, they took the MCAT before and they're coming to us for help. And these 3 steps that I'm describing to you right now is exactly what I do for every single student. First, I ask them to describe to me everything they did for their MCAT studies. What books did they use? How did they use the books? Which practice questions did they do? Did they complete? How did they do those practice questions? And so forth. So the point of asking all of these questions is really for me to determine everything that the student did for their studies. And once I learn all of this information, it allows me to identify what areas that they essentially messed up on. So some common examples are, number 1, a student not giving themselves adequate time to study. Number 2, a student, they picked up their set of books, they skimmed through the chapters, they read a few paragraphs of topics they felt like they were weak on, but didn't actually read the books. Another could be they started practice questions too late. Another could be they did practice questions, but they didn't do the AMC practice questions. So whatever the issue is with their studies, we then develop an approach to address those weaknesses. So the one thing that's tough about this, of course, is this process can be difficult if you're not too familiar with the MCAT. So if you've done all these things for your studies and you feel like you've done everything right, we definitely encourage that you ask for help. So of course, we're here and available to help answer any questions you have, but another great resource are your peers that did fantastic on the exam. So definitely consider asking for help, especially from those that scored well in the exam.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ken. So, Ken just went through a bunch of awesome tips to, boost your score as well as the cars. And so I think that for all of you guys out there who are taking the test, I mean, there's no doubt that those are going to be super helpful for you. I'm going to launch a quick poll before I turn it over to Alex here, which says, which part of the application are you most nervous about as a potential applicant to med school? Now, I know a lot of you guys are a couple of years away from applying to med school, but for those of you guys who are closer, or even when you're 2+ years away, what so far is it that is really worrying you? So we got a lot of great results there. So GPA obviously is something that a lot of people are worried about, understandably, but the MCAT, I think I hopefully stressed enough that that's something that it's super difficult to do well on, and super difficult to, sorry, I should say it's not super difficult to do well on. I think a lot of people can do well on the MCAT with the appropriate coaching and the appropriate strategy, but it's something that's extremely important to do well on. And so you guys have sort of nailed that on the head. So I'm going to turn it over to Alex now, who's going to go over a few different things. It just says tips and tricks in the car section, but he's actually got a whole bunch of different stuff to talk to you about, including 3 really high yield tips, as well as then some of his own tips on the car section. So Alex, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk to these guys a little bit about your tips.
Sure, yeah. So just as a general overview, in terms of studying for the MCAT, the way that I designed my course was actually modeled after the new curriculum that was passed and is being implemented at UCSF School of Medicine. And it's known as like a spiraling curriculum. And what the idea is that you're not expected to actually learn everything the first time you encounter the material. And so the material, initially may be presented at a really high level and may be difficult to grasp, but there is no expectation that you will get everything that first time. But what will happen is, as you continue throughout your education, you will encounter that same material over and over again, and sometimes in different contexts. And there's a lot of evidence behind, in education research, that this is the most effective way to learn. And actually, this is something that Dr. Mehta can speak to, but residency training is often structured in this sort of way, in episodic learning, where you're learning here and there, and you will encounter it over and over again until it really becomes solidified, and you won't actually be relying on a single resource or trying to remember a single chart when you're explaining like a process that you need to know, but it'll almost be like second, just part of your knowledge base that is second nature to you. And so in that respect, we think it's actually something that can be translated over to the MCAT. Obviously, the MCAT doesn't require you to demonstrate as much knowledge as you would for your licensing exams once you enter medical school, but there is quite a bit of information that you need to know for the MCAT. And our philosophy is, why not? If this works for a lot of information, it can definitely work for a more manageable piece of information. And so here we say that we really want you to get multiple passes through the same material. So built in the course that we have developed is a third column that will tell you essentially which lectures to go back to and review and go over and over and over again. And these will be spaced out such that the more time you spend away from a lecture, the more likely you will be to actually encounter that lecture again. And so it's that spaced repetition where you learn and then you give yourself some time to forget, and then you force yourself to recall and learn again. And that process, reiterated several times, will really allow you to solidify that information, which is something that's important for the MCAT, because oftentimes people have 2 to 3 month, sometimes even 6 month study protocols. And so when you have that much time over which you need to retain that knowledge, you need to have a way of making sure that you're maintaining it. And this is definitely a great way of doing that. Yeah, and so the next tip that we really want to translate over to you guys is you must master the art of remaining calm under pressure. And so you'll actually see that during your practice, a lot of the practice exams that you will take, even the ones from the AMC, though they are very accurate and are good at predicting your scores, are actually quite a bit easier than the real MCAT. And the reason for that is that you're allowed to miss more questions on the real MCAT and get a similar score. And the scale of practice exams are not as forgiving, but that's because those exams are actually easier. And so what that means is that you need to get really used to actually encountering very challenging passages, so ones that you read the first 3-4 lines and you have no idea what's going on. And it's kind of embracing those challenges that will allow you to get over that hump. And this is something that my colleagues have mentioned earlier. But if you know that you are having trouble with, for instance, art passages, that's something that I didn't really enjoy for the car section. You should read as many art passages as you can, and that way you'll be more comfortable with it. And when you see it, maybe you'll even get excited at the opportunity to be challenged. And so if you do end up seeing a passage that you feel like you're not going to do well on, maybe just take a few seconds to collect yourself, take a deep breath, and just tell yourself that this is something that you will be able to do, and you'll get over this just one passage, and you'll get through it. But having said that, it's also important to not spend too much time on that passage, and not to spend like 20 minutes on a passage, because that's really gonna hinder your ability to do well on other passages that you may be able to answer and get more questions correct. And so there's definitely a balance that you need to strike. And so you want to be calm, you want to go through passages that are difficult at a slower pace, but at the same time you don't want it to affect your ability to answer all the other questions with ample time. So that's something that you will definitely get through doing practice, but just keep that in mind when you do. And so our last tip is to really, or our next tip, sorry, is to really make the most out of your practice materials. And so saying that, we officially don't endorse any material besides the AMC. And that's because, like Dr. Mehta said earlier, they truly are the holy grail in terms of practice exams. And, we have a lot of clients ask us, hey, do you have any advice for practice materials? And we say, just use your AMC material sparingly, because there is nothing like it. There are a lot of third-party practice exams, of course, if you go out and find many of them. But the issue with those is that their logic isn't always so clean. And so you can find errors in there, and that's the last thing that you want to be dealing with when you're already studying for a difficult exam. And so the AMC will really get you in the correct mindset. The logic is great in there, and if you read the answer choice, you will always know why you were wrong. And this is especially prudent advice when it comes to the car section. Nobody else can get the car section right the way that they wanted to get it, and so truly try to spend a lot of time on the AMC material. And this includes, after you take a practice test, to spend time on, if you spend 6-7 hours taking a practice test, spend 3 to 4 times that amount actually reviewing it. The practice test is not just for you to take and see what score you might get, but it's to actually learn from them. And so, we actually recommend that you review both, obviously, the answers you got incorrectly, but the ones that you did correctly as well, because there's always something that you can learn from the answer choices and explanations that are behind them. And so next, we're just going to touch briefly on the car section in particular, because that seems like that's a really big issue for a lot of the attendees here today. And so, we actually don't endorse any of the kind of gimmicky techniques that a lot of people might talk about. And so some of these include, like, reading the questions only, and then maybe coming back to the passage and trying to pick them out, or skimming through the passage and then going to the questions and going back and forth. We don't think that, like, if there was an easy gimmick that worked, then everybody would do it and nobody would have trouble with the car section, right? So that's one hint that should clue you into those gimmicks being truly gimmicks and not actual techniques. And so we like to take the car section the way that the writers of the MCAT intended it to be taken, and that's to read the passage and then move on to the questions. Of course, you have the passage there if you need to refer to it when you get to the questions, but we really want you to get a nice first pass at that passage and try to absorb as much as you can. And the reason for that is that there are a lot of nuances in the passages that you will not get unless you really spend time learning from that passage. The arguments that are often presented in the cars section passages are very complex, and they cannot be simplified they can't be simplified to a few words, right? And so actually most people run into issues when they try to dichotomize or say that the author has like one extreme viewpoint. It's usually a very happy medium between several arguments, and so that's something that you will not catch unless you spend a lot of time reading the passages and truly understanding it. And so when you do practice tests initially, we recommend that you don't time yourself for the cars, just get in the habit of learning from the passage. And then once you've done a few and you've done really well on them, and then you can start timing yourself to make sure that you will finish all passages within the specified time frame. And so when you're choosing answer choices, we really want to reiterate that the most important thing that you can do when you're reading a passage is come up with the main idea. What is the author's essential argument? And like I said, it's never going to be something simple. It's going to be more complex and nuanced than you might see at face value. And oftentimes what happens is that it will seem like the passage starts off with a certain argument. So like you'll read the first couple lines and you see there's an argument that's been put out there, that's been postulated. And so usually when they start passages like that, the author will then spend the rest of the passage actually kind of refuting that idea or making your or you know adding caveats into that argument. And so that's something that you want to be aware of. And so finally, once you do get to the question choices, we really say that when you're starting to strike out the incorrect ones, just look for the ones that contradict the main idea, right? So, and you know, the corollary of that is to never pick an answer choice that does contradict the idea, of course, unless you're explicitly asked to. And so oftentimes you're choosing between an answer choice that is difficult to prove incorrect and one that sounds better, but there's something in there that's wrong, that's you know, that the author wouldn't agree with. And so whenever you're choosing an answer choice, just ask yourself, like, would the author agree with this? And so, you know, like it says in the slide here, we say that the correct answer is often the one that's least incorrect, that you know, that you can't really strike out. You don't have enough information to strike it out, but not that, of course, that it hasn't been justified at all. And like I said, just really try to engage yourself in the passage and pretend that you are engaging in a debate with the author and this back and forth.
Awesome, Alex, thank you so much. That was super helpful. And Alex went through a bunch of tips to really effectively study, especially using those practice questions as well as on the cars. Now, encourage you guys one more time to use the question and answer sessions, question and answer features on the GoToWebinar, because we're going to be answering a lot of those questions in a little bit. Now, before we do that, I want to turn it over to Ken again, who's going to go over some of the benefits of one-on-one tutoring, and particularly the course that Med School Coach and Curbsetter have put together in order to help you guys succeed. We've been doing this now for a number of months and have had awesome success with our students. And I think for a lot of you guys out there that are in the midst of studying or going to be studying in the next couple of months, what Ken is about to say, I think will really help you maybe put it all together in a way that will hopefully increase your score far more than, let's say, very generic, very non-structured, run-of-the-mill course that a lot of the big companies are offering. What we really do is try to really distill things down to what your individual weaknesses are, and Ken will talk a little bit about that here. So Ken, you want to talk a little bit about how one-on-one tutoring may fit into somebody's study schedule?
Yeah, of course. So of course, I want to start off by talking about the program that we have created here for the Med School Coach. And the main point is that we really offer to our students everything that they need to succeed on the exam. And really, that's going to be three main components: fantastic tutors, an excellent video course, and the best practice questions out there, the ones from the AAMC. Now, in terms of our tutors, you can see right on this slide that we have extremely high requirements for our tutors. And this is not what you see at other test prep companies. Most test prep companies, their standards for their tutors are just students who have scored the 90th percentile on the MCAT. And I'm certainly not saying 90th percentile score is bad, but to be honest, students who scored at the 90th percentile really do not know their content well enough to be teaching it to someone else, which means they always have areas of weaknesses. And that, of course, is difficult as a student learning from them who are also struggling with the same weaknesses. So the expectations we set on our tutors are extremely high. All of our tutors have scored at the 99th percentile or higher on each section that they tutor. And not only that, we also have very strict requirements. As you know, there's a lot of people out there who are very smart, but aren't necessarily good teachers. So all of our tutors go through a very rigorous training process, and the large majority of them don't pass, not because they're not smart, but just because they're not able to connect with students and communicate their knowledge effectively. The second component that we have here is the video course that is created by Curve Centers. Now, as Sahil mentioned earlier, there's a lot of companies out there that have created video courses, but much of those, or many of those videos, are recycled from the video courses they created for the old MCAT. So the video course that we'll provide you is created brand new in 2018. So you can be guaranteed that all the videos you're watching is based on content that you need to know for the current exam and not old videos based on the old MCAT. Now, the way that we're able to help you with our tutoring program is the fact that we've got all these steps right here. And you can see the first step here is that it's personalized, which is really the great thing about tutoring. If you go and take a course, that course is a one-size-fits-all. You know, everyone goes through the course. But in our experience working with students, we find that every student is unique. And we have worked with students of all sorts of backgrounds and of all sorts of backgrounds and strengths and weaknesses. So, you know, some examples I'll throw out there are, for instance, students who aren't science majors, right? So people who majored in the humanities, or people who are career changers and their science background may not be as strong because they didn't take as many courses. We also have the opposite. We also have students who are science majors who struggle a lot with the CARS sections. So we have a lot of fantastic CARS tutor. Or other students who are facing other difficulties. Perhaps they have testing anxiety, or students where English is not their first language. Just about any possible scenario you can think of, we have worked with before, and we can personalize the study plan for every student to make sure that they're able to succeed. Now, another thing I want to mention about, you know, having fantastic tutors is that when you study by yourself, certainly, you know, you can use fantastic books and fantastic questions, but sometimes it takes you a long time to understand a concept, right? And all of you know this as you're studying. Sometimes it just takes you like a week to figure out this concept, and sometimes it might not stick. So the great thing about working with tutors is instead of having to take weeks to figure out on your own, a tutor is able to just teach it for you, so you're able to study more efficiently and essentially get through more material and ultimately raise your score. So by working with the tutors that we have, you're certainly going to become a better test taker and have a significantly higher chance of reaching your target score. So in terms of what happens when you work with us is once you sign up for one of our tutoring programs, you will fill out an intake form, which is going to ask you a lot of information about your background. We're going to use that information about your background to pair you up with a tutor that is going to be able to fulfill all the needs you have to attain your target score. And then you're going to start attending tutoring sessions with your tutor, which typically is going to involve content review, going over strategies, or a combination of the two. And as Sahil has mentioned already, we've had a lot of very good success with our program so far, that our average students improve their scores by 10 points. And the last thing I want to bring up is our guarantee. So as with many test prep companies out there, we want to make sure that our students are happy with the experience that they have with us. But one difference you're going to see between the guarantee that we provide and with all of those other large test prep companies is that their guarantees are very, very long, like multiple pages with all this fine text in there. And we don't have any of that. Our satisfaction guarantee is very, very clear. If you're not happy with your tutor at any point, we will switch another tutor until you're happy with the tutor you have. If you're not happy with the tutoring that you're getting, we're more than happy to refund your unused hours. And finally, for the score increase guarantee, if your score does not increase, we will work with you for another 10 hours for free. And I just want to throw this out there as well, that at this point, we have not had a single student use our score increase guarantee. So certainly we've been doing very well.
Awesome. Thank you, Ken, for going through that. So, now we've had a chance to go through a lot of tips and tricks, as well as talk a little bit about how our individual tutoring may help you. Now is the time for us to open up the questions, open up the Q&A forum. And so as I go through, Ken has already talked a little bit about our MCAT program. We're going to plug it a few more times just to make sure you guys take a look at it. There's a lot of great MCAT programs out there, but we really think that we've created one that's awesome for you. Now, I want to take this opportunity to kind of scour the questions, and what I'm going to do is kind of fire them at Ken and Alex one by one and get their expert thoughts on some of these questions that you guys are asking. So keep them coming. Alex, why don't we start with you? I'm going to, there's a question out here that says, how do you recommend preparing for the MCAT while taking a heavy course load on top of a full-time job? So maybe let's generalize the question. A lot of students out there are taking the MCAT in the middle of their junior year, maybe their sophomore year, maybe their senior year, and they have a lot of other things on their plate. They don't, unfortunately, they can't fit in the 8 to 12 weeks of dedicated MCAT study time and nothing else. They just have other priorities and other things that they have to do. How do you recommend people who have these additional things that they have to get done study for the MCAT at the same time?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I appreciate that someone asked that, because I got asked that all the time. And so I have a couple of tips for situations like that. The first thing I'm going to say is that you have to figure out a way to make sure that you are going to revisit that information over and over again. And just like you should be reiterating over your information, this is something that I've been reiterating over this presentation. So just make sure that you figure out, some method, whether it's flashcards. It works differently for everybody else. Some people like to use flashcards. I personally like to go over lectures, go over lecture slides. And so you want to focus on high yield material, and that's my next tip. So don't go for materials that will bog you down in details, because you're going to forget those details. If that's what you're focusing on, you want to focus on really the big ticket ideas and just review that over and over again. You don't have to be spending 8 hours a day, especially if you don't have it, you can't. And so, just to have 1 to 2 hours a day of really high yield review. And as you progress throughout your content review time, you spend more and more time reviewing previous material versus learning new material. You want to try to leave, maybe a week or two where you can spend more time. And so, if you can take a lighter load, or right after exams, you can kind of pick that up. That'll be great. And that'll allow you to do like short bursts of maybe practice tests. That'll allow you to, take them and then review those material. But for the most part, it's manageable. You're just going to have a protracted time frame, and the biggest risk when you're taking a long time frame is, recalling that information over a long period of time. So I would say flashcards or lecture notes in a PowerPoint format are really good to do long-term recall.
Awesome, thank you. Ken, we got a question out there. This is for somebody who's taken the MCAT previously. So if you've taken the MCAT previously and they're taking it again to study, what is the biggest thing that you recommend in terms of reviewing old practice tests? So a lot of people have maybe gone through the same practice test already. Is it effective to review the same practice test or do it again? Or how do you recommend they go about studying for the second time?
Yeah, so specifically in regard to the practice tests, you absolutely do have to redo all of the AMC practice questions if you're taking the MCAT again. And that might sound a bit, redundant. If you've done all these questions before, why are you doing them again? And this goes back to what we've referenced before, that the AMC questions are really the best questions out there. So you don't want to just use them once. You want to use them multiple times, and until you really fully understand how the AMC writes their questions, what is the content you need to know, and how can you answer those questions correctly. Now, by doing the questions again, I can guarantee that you're not going to get 100% of the questions correct. And I say this just because I've worked with over 1,000 students at this point on the MCAT. And all these students, when they take the AMC questions again, they're missing a lot of questions again. And that's really able to provide you a lot of insight, right? If these are questions that you've done before, that you've looked at the solutions before, and now you're doing them again, but you're still getting them wrong, it means that you clearly still have issues that you need to resolve, whether it is with content or with strategy or your approach. So certainly got to redo all of the AMC questions.
Awesome. There's a question out there that I can take, which is sort of, does your chances of getting into, or do your chances of getting into medical school take a hit if you take the MCAT multiple times? Now, I've worked with a few thousand students, and I can tell you that probably about 60% of them have taken the MCAT multiple times. So taking the MCAT twice is not really an issue, particularly obviously if you get a higher score. Different schools will use different utilizations of the scores. So some will take the average, some will take the highest. But bottom line is, taking the MCAT twice is okay. No doubt about it. There's nothing negative about it, particularly obviously if you raise your score. Now, I've worked with an applicant who took the MCAT 7 times, official 7 scores. And that was probably the most I think I've seen. We got her into med school, but that is too many times to take the MCAT. So what you have to do if you're going to take the MCAT more than once, and first of all, I would say that I never really recommend somebody going into an MCAT thinking, I'm going to take this again. You got to go in there thinking, I'm going to do as well as possible on this particular test. Because if you're not going to do as well as possible on that particular test, then maybe you should have postponed the test for some reason, or we should work with you and figure out what it is that you need to do. Maybe take an extra 2, 3, 4 weeks in order to improve your score. But regardless, for those of you who are going to take it more than once, it's not really that much of an issue. You can definitely take it twice. You can even take it 3 times. But every single time you take it, I want you to understand that, hey, what should I be doing to increase my chances the next time around, right? How am I changing myself in order to do better this time around? So let's aim for twice at most, 3 times if you really need to stretch it. Don't aim for any more than that, but that's sort of my general spiel on how often you should retake the MCAT, or if you have to retake the MCAT, what you have to do. Alex, we got a question out there that talks a little bit about, let's find a good question here for you. There's a question. I'm trying to get a good. Okay, here's a good question. This is a non-traditional student. So a non-traditional student who maybe is a little bit further away from the prerequisite courses, maybe has taken them a couple of years ago. What do you recommend in terms of studying for them? Should they approach studying any differently?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question as well. There's a tendency for those who are non-traditional to feel like maybe they're at a disadvantage, and there might be some argument for that. They haven't taken those classes in a while. Actually, some non-traditionals have, though, if they've done a post-act program. So it actually does depend on your situation. if you are, depends on how far removed you are from the material, and if you're considered like a career changer where you never considered medicine, and now you have to take a post-bac to get up to speed on those classes, versus just having taken 3-4 years out from undergrad and now you're studying for the MCAT. And so that's one consideration that you have to make. Is it the first time you're going to see the material in a very long time, or have you encountered this material in a post-bac and you still feel like you're a little bit behind? But I think, regardless of what your situation is, it's imperative that you focus on high-yield resources, and that's because while the MCAT is a content exam, this is something that Ken and Dr. Mehta have touched on before. It's much more than that, and if you just have the content down, you're not going to get anywhere without having the strategies down. And so what we say is that the most, when you're going through practice tests, you'll see that there are really two things they are asking you to do. It's one is identify what the question is truly getting at, like what is the underlying question, and two, find what the underlying content is. And usually the underlying content is very simple. It's not like a difficult concept. It's not something that is buried within one of those content books from other prep companies. It's usually something very simple, like how many orbitals are there, for instance, in this given atom or something, or can you locate this atom on the periodic table and figure out the properties of it. And so in that respect, we say that whether you're a non-traditional or a traditional student, we really want you to focus on high yield resources, truly getting the fundamental concepts down. If you are doing that and you still feel like maybe you're still not up to speed, you can always supplement that information with things that resources you can find online. Wikipedia is actually great when you're trying to look up a certain topic and you're interested to learn more about it. But really, we wouldn't recommend that you treat it any differently. You might just have to spend more time having been a non-traditional student, and this will be considered as your first pass or only your second pass, and not your like fourth, fifth, or sixth, like someone who's always been a science major. But yeah, we really, our ultimate recommendation would be focus on high yield materials.
Awesome, thank you. Ken, there's a question out here that I think is interesting, which says, what do you recommend? Do you recommend a speed reading class for the CARS section or any other section of the MCAT? And can that help me? What have you typically told your students?
Yeah, so this would depend on the student. So increasing your reading pace, certainly can sound fantastic. If you're able to read through the text quickly, perhaps you're able to get through more passages and more questions, especially if you're a student that is a slow test taker. There are a few things to consider. So one of the things is that when you're reading MCAT CARS passages, it is important for you to be able to understand the text. So if all you're doing is reading the text super quickly, but all of it's just going, over your head, and you're not taking in any of the information, then certainly speed reading is not going to help you. So for the CARS section, I would say it's a balance. You don't want to read too slowly, because if you're reading too slowly, then you're not giving yourself enough time to get to the questions. If you're reading too quickly, then you're not giving yourself enough time to understand the passage, and you're going to get all of the questions wrong. So ideally, you want to be at more of the middle ground, where you're reading the passage at a good pace and still have adequate time to do all of the practice questions. Now, for most students, that would mean for the CARS passages, you want to go through the passage in between 3 to 5 minutes. So I would say if you're a student who cannot read the text within 5 minutes, then you may want to consider a speed reading software, because at that point, it's going to be very difficult for you to have enough time to answer all the questions.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, guys, so we're basically getting up at 10 o'clock here now. A lot of you guys have amazing questions that you guys are asking on the Q&A, and I wish we could get to every single one of them, but unfortunately we just can't. But I do encourage you guys to do a couple of things that I think will help you. So if you guys, number one, have individual questions that you want answered or are looking for answers to, what I would suggest doing is checking out a couple of important resources. The first being Prospective Doctor, which is a site run by us and has a ton of free resources about navigating medical school as well as MCAT. And on top of that, we actually have our Prospective Doctor video channel, which you guys should definitely check out, where people like Ken go through things like, what target score and how many hours of the MCAT you should study. And you could drop us questions on that, and we're definitely happy to answer them as time goes on. So if you go to YouTube and search Prospective Doctor, you're going to find that so that you can look at that. The next thing I'll just let you guys know, for those of you guys who are out there and taking the MCAT soon and want some help or applying to med school this year, obviously we can definitely help you out at Med School Coach. We have a ton of resources. We have our MCAT program along with the Curve Setter video that we've already talked about. And then we also have admissions consulting to kind of help you guys figure out, if you should apply, when you should apply, what schools you should choose, all those kind of things. So I would encourage you guys to check out our website to explore our services a little bit more. Finally, lots of questions on if this webinar will be available for recording and viewing later on. And yes, we definitely will post it. We'll actually post it on the Prospective Doctor YouTube channel. So the best way to get it is actually to go onto YouTube right now and subscribe to the Prospective Doctor YouTube channel. So if you Google YouTube and Prospective Doctor, you should come up with our YouTube channel, and there you should be able to just hit the subscribe button. That's going to allow us to drop you a whole bunch of videos, including the webinar that you saw tonight. So please go ahead and subscribe to that if you guys want access to that. So hopefully this was helpful for a lot of you guys out there who are taking the MCAT soon. Again, I really want to thank everybody for taking some time out of their Monday night to join us. I really want to thank Ken and Alex for taking their time and sharing their expertise. These guys are great, and they're available to all of you guys out there who need extra help. So I encourage you guys to contact us at medschoolcoach.com, and we can hook you up with that help. Alex, Ken, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much. It's an honor.
All right. Good night, everybody. Again, check out those resources I mentioned, and thanks again. See you all soon, and good luck on the MCAT.